Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we are setting the stage for what is, without a doubt, the most monumental turning point in modern history. The conflict we're going to examine today fundamentally rewired global politics. It shattered centuries-old empires and introduced a scale of destruction that humanity had never, ever imagined. I'm talking, of course, about the First World War. I mean, it's just a staggering thought, right? What actually happens when a single bullet drags the entire world into war? We tend to look back at history as this inevitable march of grand events. But the First World War shows us something entirely different. It shows us history as a catastrophic chain reaction, a perfectly engineered trap that basically sprung shut in just a matter of weeks. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for making sense of all this chaos. We're going to break it down into 5 parts: the global powder keg, the Sarajevo spark, a new kind of war, the shifting tides, and finally, the treaty and aftermath. All right, Act 1, the global powder keg. Because, let's be honest, this war didn't just appear out of nowhere. For decades, Europe had been slowly, almost methodically, stacking the explosives that would eventually blow up the entire old world order. A massive, absolutely crucial part of those explosives was something called aggressive nationalism. And this wasn't just simple patriotism, okay? Imagine a fierce, unyielding love for your own country that actually relies on a deep hatred and suspicion of your neighbors. This incredibly toxic mindset drove intense expansionist and imperialistic policies. Nations didn't just want to be prosperous, they wanted to dominate. They scrambled for colonies in places like Asia and Africa just to extract raw materials and build captive markets. It was essentially a zero-sum game. For one nation to win, another literally had to lose. And military strength? Well, that became the ultimate symbol of national prestige. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer paranoia of it all. The race for armaments was this psychological trap driven entirely by fear. Think about it. One country decides to beef up its military purely in the name of self-defense and preserving peace. Well, its neighbors immediately panic, assume it's an act of aggression, and feel compelled to stockpile weapons too. It's a vicious, endless cycle. By 1914, Germany had left Britain and France far behind in steel production and was heavily building up its navy. In 1912, they built the Imperator, the largest ship in the world at the time. They even had to deepen the Kiel Canal just so their massive new battleships could maneuver. So all of this intense militarism naturally led to intense paranoia, which resulted in a rigid, deeply flawed alliance system. Europe essentially divided itself into 2 heavily armed, entirely hostile camps. On one side of the board, you had the Triple Alliance, formed back in 1882. That's Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And on the other side, stepping up to counter this perceived threat, you had the Triple Entente, formed in 1907, made up of Britain, France, and Russia. This system basically guaranteed that a small, localized conflict would be impossible. If one nation threw a punch, everybody fought. Just take a look at Europe in 1914, and you can perfectly visualize this physical chessboard. Notice how incredibly densely packed these major powers are. You've got Germany sandwiched right between France to the west and the massive Russian Empire to the east. You can visibly see how claustrophobic and inherently tense this whole geopolitical setup was. With the major powers locked into these opposing alliances, the entire continent was wired to detonate. Which brings us to Act 2, the Sarajevo spark. The heavily armed powder keg was completely set. All it needed was a single, localized spark to set the whole thing off. And, unfortunately, this was that spark. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Francis Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was visiting Sarajevo. During that visit, he was assassinated by the Black Hand, which was a secret society of extremist Serbian nationalists whose ultimate goal was to unite all Serbians into a single state. That one fatal act became the immediate trigger for the greatest conflict the world had ever seen up to that point. Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds, because the speed of what happens next is simply terrifying. Watch these dominoes fall. On July 23rd, Austria serves Serbia with a really harsh ultimatum containing 11 demands. Surprisingly, Serbia actually accepted most of them, but they rejected the ones that would cost them their sovereignty. So, July 28th hits, and Austria declares war on Serbia. Russia, who is allied with Serbia, starts preparing for war. On August 1st, Germany, allied with Austria, declares war on Russia. Then German troops decide to march right through neutral Belgium to get to France, and because of that violation, on August 4th, Britain declares war on Germany. In a matter of days, regional tension collapsed into a full-blown world war.
The dominoes fell exactly as the alliance system dictated. No way out. Act 3. A new kind of war. What these nations stumbled into in August of 1914 was absolutely nothing like the cavalry charges and contained battles of the 19th century. No, this was industrial-scale slaughter. The defining experience on the Western Front was trench warfare. Because machine guns and heavy artillery made life above ground literally impossible, opposing armies really had no choice but to dig hundreds of miles of defensive trenches. The conditions down in the dirt were visceral. They were horrifying. Soldiers were trapped in this miserable stalemate. They endured thick mud that rain and snow turned into caves of slime. They fought alongside rats, lived with the constant, terrifying threat of lethal poison gas, and suffered through food shortages and the omnipresent stench of the dead. For about 4 agonizing years, neither side could substantially dislodge the other. And this brilliantly illustrates how unprecedented mechanical innovations forever changed the destructive scale of human conflict. On one hand, you had German U-boats, or submarines, aggressively sinking ships to starve out entire nations by cutting off their food and raw materials. Meanwhile, on land, these armored behemoths called tanks were introduced specifically to try and break that impossible trench stalemate. These new methods of defense and destruction meant the war wasn't just fought by armies on a battlefield anymore. It was now targeting global civilian populations. Let's look at Act 4, the shifting tides. 1917 proved to be the pivotal turning point, bringing massive geopolitical shifts that fundamentally altered the war's trajectory. In 1917, the geopolitical landscape completely fractured. Over on the Eastern Front, the Russian Empire suffered catastrophic losses. We're talking over 600,000 soldiers killed. This absolute collapse led directly to the Bolshevik Revolution and their ultimate exit from the war via the really harsh Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in early 1918. But just as the Allies lost Russia, they gained an industrial giant. Driven by the tragic sinking of the passenger ship Lusitania and real fears that a victorious Germany would threaten American financial loans to the Allies, the United States declared war on Germany in April 1917. This breathed vital, much-needed life into the Allied cause. By the time Britain, France, and the USA launched their final military offensive in July 1918, which led to the collapse of the Central Powers, the human cost was just incomprehensible. 9 million dead. I want you to pause and take a moment to let the gravity of that number really sink in. Between 53 and 70 million people fought in this war. The 9 million who perished represented roughly 1/7 of all who participated. And remember, this doesn't even count the millions more who are permanently disabled, or the civilians killed by air raids, epidemics, and famines. Finally, Act 5, the Treaty and Aftermath. With an armistice signed on November 11, 1918, the world was left to somehow piece a completely shattered world back together at the Paris Peace Conference. So the crucial point is the financial toll. $33 billion. That was the staggering amount fixed for reparations. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to pay for all loss and damage suffered by the Allies. They had to hand over merchant ships and supplied massive quantities of coal to France, Italy, and Belgium for a whole decade. It was a crushing, completely unfathomable economic weight, and it was designed specifically to keep Germany permanently crippled. Let's neutrally and systematically break down the punishing terms of the Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919. The treaty was fundamentally designed to prevent Germany from ever going to war again. First up, guilt. The treaty explicitly declared Germany guilty of starting the aggression. Second, military limitations. The German army was severely restricted to just 100,000 soldiers, and their navy to 15,000 men. The Air Force and submarines were completely banned, and the Rhine Valley was demilitarized. Third, territory. Germany lost the region of Alsace-Lorraine back to France, parts of her pre-war territory to countries like Denmark and Poland, and most significantly, Germany lost all of her colonies to the victorious Allies. Now, direct your eyes to this newly drawn map of Europe. It's almost unrecognizable compared to where we started. The war didn't just move borders around, it erased empires. The peace treaties destroyed 3 massive ruling dynasties, the Romanovs in Russia, the Hohenzollerns in Germany, and the Habsburgs in Austria-Hungary. Gone. In their place, new independent states were born based on nationality, places you recognize today, like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The political map of the world was profoundly, permanently transformed. Emerging from all this devastation was an incredibly ambitious idea, largely driven by American President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. It was called the League of Nations. It was created as an international organization of independent states with a truly noble mission: to preserve peace, guarantee independence, and promote cultural and economic cooperation. However, This noble mission had a fatal structural flaw. The very nation that championed it, the United States, ultimately decided not to join. With the U.S. entirely absent and defeated countries excluded for years, this lack of global unity severely, critically weakened the League from its very inception. So we've seen how aggressive nationalism, sheer paranoia, and a single bullet toppled empires and rewrote the map of the world. But looking at the crushing terms of the Treaty of Versailles and the seriously compromised foundation of the League of Nations, I'll leave you with this final, lingering thought to reflect on. If the treaty designed to end all wars only planted the bitter seeds for the next one, just how fragile is global peace? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating and incredibly complex history with me in today's Explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.